Every major government on Earth is printing money. In the last 5 years, the United States has added more dollars to circulation than in its entire previous history combined. The European Central Bank expanded its balance sheet to over 8 trillion euros, and Japan has been printing so aggressively that its central bank now owns more than half the country's entire government bond market. Yet nobody in any government building actually calls it printing. They use careful language. They call it quantitative easing, asset purchases, or liquidity injection. But the math is not careful. When every country simultaneously creates money from nothing, the question those institutions avoid answering out loud is simple and brutal. If everyone is printing, who is actually getting poorer? The standard answer is inflation. Prices rise, purchasing power falls, and everyone suffers equally. But history shows that answer is incomplete. Inflation is not a tide that raises and lowers all boats equally. It is a current, and like all currents, it actively moves wealth in a specific direction, towards specific people and away from specific others. The question to ask is not whether prices are rising. The true question is whose assets are rising faster than prices, and whose income is falling behind them. You have to look at the distinct gaps in the economy, the space between the asset owner and wage earner, or between the debtor and the saver. Somewhere in that gap, between the institution and the individual, is where the answer to who gets poorer actually lives. The first massive experiment in government money printing happened in France in 1716. The nation was broke after Louis XIV's wars, gold was scarce, and a Scottish economist named John Law proposed an elegant, catastrophic solution: replace metal money with unbacked paper notes. The government printed, and euphoria followed. Ordinary French citizens, merchants, craftsmen, and minor nobility poured their life savings into paper shares. For a brief period, people became rich on paper overnight. Then, in 1720, confidence broke. Investors tried to convert their paper back to gold all at once. There wasn't enough gold, and the currency collapsed. But the losses were not shared equally. The nobles and court insiders who received early shares had already quietly converted their paper wealth into hard assets like land and gold before the crash. The late receivers, the merchants and craftsmen who blindly trusted the system, absorbed the inflation and were left holding worthless paper. 300 years before the Federal Reserve existed, John Law demonstrated the iron rule of monetary expansion, the first to receive new money profit, and the last to receive it pay. The most well-known money printing episode in history is Weimar Germany. History books tell it as a story of universal suffering and societal collapse. But what they rarely mention is that while society collapsed, some people got spectacularly rich. Hugo Stinnes was a German industrialist who built an absolute empire during the worst of the hyperinflation. Stinnes borrowed enormous sums of marks before the currency collapsed. As the printing accelerated, his massive debts became mathematically trivial, while his factories, mines, and real estate retained their physical value. The pattern was precise. Leveraged factory owners and farmers who held land came out ahead. Meanwhile, pensioners on fixed incomes and middle-class families who had saved carefully were financially annihilated. Weimar did not create random poverty. It executed a specific, systemic wealth transfer from responsible savers to heavily leveraged asset owners. So why does this exact transfer of wealth from savers to asset owners happen repeatedly across different centuries and economic systems? The answer is timing. Economists call this the Cantillon Effect, named after the 18th century economist who first described it. When central banks create money, it doesn't land equally. It enters through financial institutions at the top of a distribution chain. Those closest receive it first, investing at yesterday's prices. By the time it trickles down to wages, the cost of living has already surged. Because money is not neutral, its specific point of entry ensures that poverty is mathematically created at the very end of the distribution chain. Following the crises of 2008 and 2020, central banks like the Federal Reserve expanded their balance sheets by trillions of dollars. They printed this money specifically to rescue financial institutions. The stated goal was to stimulate the broader economy, but the reality was that the newly created money flowed immediately into inflating financial assets, like stocks, bonds, and real estate. As a result, the wealthiest 10% of the population saw their net worth expand enormously without having to produce any new goods or services. Meanwhile, ordinary workers faced historically sluggish wage growth. The money reached them last, filtered through years of asset inflation that made housing, healthcare, and education structurally more expensive. Nobody announced this transfer. Modern monetary policy acts as a quiet, invisible mechanism that moves trillions of dollars directly from savers and retirees to financial institutions, all without a single public vote. The people getting poorer today are the ones at the very end of the modern Cantillon chain: the unpropertied, the salaried workers, the pensioners, and the young. These victims are not randomly distributed. They are precisely the same class of people who absorbed the collapse in 1720 and 1923. The brutal irony is that the people getting poorer are precisely those who did everything right, the ones who saved cash and trusted the system. John Law's French citizens held paper. Weimar's middle class held marks. Post-2008 workers held wages. In every era, the insiders held hard assets. Printing money is never neutral. It is an active policy that secretly taxes financial responsibility to reward proximity to power, and the winners are simply never the ones who get asked.